To understand William James, you must understand the household he grew up in. And to understand the household, you must understand Henry James Sr., the father, one of the most brilliant, erratic, and spiritually tormented figures in 19th century American intellectual life. Henry Sr. had inherited a substantial fortune from his own father, which freed him from the necessity of a conventional career and allowed him to pursue, with total commitment, the philosophical and theological questions that obsessed him. He had been converted as a young man, if converted is the right word, by a terrifying psychological experience he encountered while sitting quietly at the dinner table. Without warning, he felt overwhelmed by a presence of evil so intense, so personal, and so real that he was paralyzed with fear. He called this experience avastation, a term he borrowed from the Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, and it changed the direction of his entire life. From that moment, Henry Sr. dedicated himself to understanding the nature of the self, the relationship between evil and spiritual growth, and the Swedenborgian theology of divine influx, the idea that God flows into human consciousness not by overriding individual will but by working through it. He wrote prolifically, spoke publicly, and spent his children's childhood moving the family back and forth across Europe in search of the right educational environment, and, one suspects, in an attempt to outrun his own restlessness. The consequences for William were profound and complicated. He received an education that was unusually rich in content and unusually unstable in form. Multiple schools, multiple countries, multiple languages. He was exposed from childhood to the most serious theological and philosophical questions, but in a household where the usual institutional frameworks for addressing them, church, university, social convention, were treated with suspicion. Henry Sr. wanted his children to think for themselves. He succeeded, perhaps more than he intended. William's famous breakdown in 1870, the period of suicidal depression and philosophical despair that he would later describe obliquely in the varieties of religious experience, bears striking resemblance to his father's vastation, and James himself seems to have been aware of this. The breakdown was triggered partly by James's inability to reconcile his scientific training with any coherent picture of human freedom and meaning. His father's response to a similar crisis had been the discovery of Swedenborg. William's response would eventually be pragmatism, a more secular but structurally similar move away from paralyzing abstraction toward a philosophy that grounded truth in living experience. Henry Sr's influence on William's psychology of religion was also direct, even if William transformed what he inherited beyond recognition. Henry believed that genuine religious life required the dissolution of the isolated, self-reliant ego, a kind of spiritual death that opened the individual to divine life. William, who was constitutionally suspicious of systematic theology and always more empiricist than his father, translated this into a psychological observation, that the twice-born religious personality, who passes through crisis and breakdown into a transformed sense of self, tends to achieve a depth of integration and vitality that the once-born, never-tested personality does not. The theological claim became a psychological one. The structure of the argument remained. Henry Sr. died in 1882, just as William was finding his mature voice. William delivered the eulogy, a document of extraordinary feeling that reveals how deeply, beneath all his ambivalence and rebellion, he loved his impossible father. He described Henry's life as a life that was triumphant, a life lived with total commitment to the things that mattered most, regardless of worldly recognition. The shadow the father cast was long. William James's most characteristic qualities, his combination of empirical rigor and spiritual openness, his insistence that the deepest questions of human life must be faced rather than argued away, his sympathy for religious experience even as he submitted it to psychological analysis, all have roots in the peculiar household on Quincy Street in Cambridge, where a Swedenborgian mystic raised a generation of geniuses in an atmosphere of loving, chaotic, unrelenting seriousness about the life of the mind. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.